How long do you want to?
Good. Everyone knows now that the conversation is being recorded, and everyone will have access to that recording very soon. I mean, it was the last one we did was 24 hours, I think, something like that. I also want to thank Sumava and his colleagues for this opportunity. We had a very interesting discussion of Hans Lucas Kieser's history of Lausanne with the title "The Day Democracy Died," only a few weeks ago. And therefore there is every reason to believe that there will be further conversations. I'm going to have a conversation more generally, but including Lausanne, with my old friend Peter Balakian on the 21st of August to refer to, not only refer, but to develop his own current writing and poetry, which I think is among the most powerful forms of historical remembrance that I know anywhere. So I invite everybody to hear what Peter has to say in this venue on the 21st of August. We all know that Monday morning is the exact centenary of the signing of the Lausanne Treaty in 1923, and that its significance has been a subject of disagreement over a long period of time. My old friend Zara Steiner saw it as a success. I never understood how she reached that conclusion, but there is a clear line of argument in which we can say, as much as all of the peace treaties of 1919 to 1923 are disputed in one way or another, so is Lausanne, and maybe more so now than in the past. So I was very happy to invite Lerna Ekmegjolu. I hope I got close to pronunciation. I've been practicing. And it's an important moment to consider Lausanne and its significance in multiple dimensions. Lerna will be the first speaker. She is a professor of history at MIT and the Macmillan Stewart Associate Professor, as I have it right, as well as the director of the Women and Gender Studies program. She'll be followed by Mustafa Aksakal, the Nasuhi Erdogan Chair of Modern Turkish Studies at Georgetown University. I should have said before turning to Mustafa that one of the most stimulating books that I read in a long time about the Armenian tragedy is Lerna's Recovering Armenia, The Limits of Belonging in Post-Genocide Turkey. And it allows me to say, not for the first time, thank you, Lerna, for a most impressive contribution. Mustafa, I've known his work longer, and indeed pressed to every student I taught, pressed to his bosom, the Ottoman Road to War in 1914, because it's a rare example of a book in a field that is very well trodden. Every country has a road to war, but very few of them have the power of analysis and tragedy that I think I would say your book elicits. That word is used, I use advisedly. It's a work of great importance. And my longest standing friend among the participants, Len Smith from Oberlin College, who has been for 2 decades, 20 years, 21 years maybe, the Frederick B. Arts.
Three.
Oh, okay, fair enough. The Frederick B. Arts Professor of History at Oberlin College. And his landmark contribution, among others, I should say, in French history in particular, and in First World War history, To our inquiry today is his book on sovereignty at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, published in 2018. He persuaded me that the term sovereignty should not be left in the hands of German right-wing theorists. It's a subject much too important to be left to Carl Schmitt. Thank you, Len, for that brilliant introduction to this contested field. My proposal is that we give each of the speakers 15 minutes to answer as they wish, in any form they wish, the question of what is the significance of Lausanne in their minds. And after the three of them speak, I might venture a few questions, or maybe even a fourth point of view, if that comes to it. My guesses will overlap, and then open the discussion for exchange among the speakers and among those who are with us by Zoom. So I think the best way forward, if everyone agrees, Lena, is to give the microphone, as it were, electronically to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jay, and Sumawa for organizing this and inviting me so that we can mark the centennial of the Lausanne together. I wrote my comments just to be able to keep time. So Lausanne, of course, deserves our attention for so many reasons. The most important is that it is still in effect. Unlike most other post-World War I peace treaties, it survived World War II. It survived the transformation of the League of Nations into the United Nations. It survived the Cold War. It survived the end of the Cold War, and it survived various internal upheavals, most importantly, the Kurdish insurgencies throughout the 100-year history of the Turkish Republic. The longevity of Lausanne is precious for the social scientists and humanists. It's a perfect lab to reflect upon and perhaps test various hypotheses. The question that has most interested me for a long time is that of minority-majority relationships, especially those between historically wronged minority groups and continuously dominant majorities with criminal pasts. The paradigmatic example for me is post-genocide Armenians in Turkey, where the bulk of my research has focused thus far, but I have other examples in mind as well. I'm in Boston, and this is the summer of 2023. The US Supreme Court recently struck down affirmative action in university admissions, mostly to prevent race, that's Blackness, from counting as legitimate ground for positive discrimination in college applications. Last week, the Republican Party's conservative hardliners attacked diversity, equity, and inclusion measures as part of their defense bill. I keep asking myself, are there any real ways to sustain just reconciliation between majorities and minorities that do not result in resentment of the majority, while at the same time respecting the needs of the minority for restitution and acknowledgement? I'm also here today sharing these remarks with colleagues in post-partition India. I have Muslims in India or Hindus in Pakistan in mind after 1946-47. What kind of post-violence legislation would have ensured long-term security and full and unquestioned feelings of belonging for these groups who are displaced or misplaced? I think the Conference of Lausanne and the ensuing treaty gives us insight into some do's and don'ts of minority-majority coexistence. I don't have time to develop a major argument here, and some of it I've already published. Instead, I'll provide in the next 10 minutes or so my reading of the processes that led to the minority protection clauses of the treaty and briefly discuss its consequences. I'll sprinkle some of my gender analysis here and there, as this is how I recently come to view these processes, especially after like 7 years of somehow marking centennial after centennial and talking about the same things. I really have to spice things up at this point. In 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne codified a certain kind of ethno-religious coexistence for the new Turkey. The first question we must address is, who did the treaty define as minorities? Non-Muslim nationals of Turkey is the language that the treaty used. To clarify, the treaty did not specify any one ethnic group, but named religion as the only criterion for minority status. This designation effectively rendered Muslims the majority. This majority status, however, had been produced at least partially by artificial processes of demographic engineering, including a genocide, the elimination of Armenian, Assyrian, and Pontic Greek Christians by a man-made plan. Yet the treaty considered anything that had happened before 1914 to be prehistory, no more relevant to the current political situation than dinosaurs or 18th century earthquakes. In other words, the Treaty of Lausanne naturalized consequences of lethal political decisions and therefore rewarded murderers. The genocide was committed to minimize the number of Armenians to prevent them from making claims in the present and in the future, especially to territory. The Lausanne Treaty sealed this plan. Non-Muslims, Christians and Jews, were naturalized into new Turkish citizenship as minorities. The second issue of the Treaty of Lausanne that we must address is the fact that the Turkish state agreed to give to bestow a limited number of extra rights to minorities. 7 of 143 articles in the treaty pertain to the rights of minorities in the new Turkey. They include the freedom to conduct their religious affairs, to use their mother tongues, to continue their presses, to conduct the affairs of their educational and charitable institutions, and the freedom to continue to use their canonical laws in personal status matters such as marriage, divorce, and inheritance. Another article states that these rights may not constitute grounds for discrimination against minorities and that no future Turkish law can override them. In addition, these minority protections, quote, constitute obligations of international concern, end of quote. They were thus placed under the guarantee of the League of Nations. Originally, the Ankara government did not want to agree to confer minority status on anyone, arguing that in the new Turkey, everyone would be treated equally and no one would need extra protections to sustain their culture or religion. But the Turkish side had to compromise because the allies insisted upon it. We must ask why. The British, French, and the Italians insisted on granting Christians and Jewish Jews in Turkey some minority rights. This was not because they cared about the future well-being of Christians and Jews in Turkey, though they did have domestic constituencies who they needed to satisfy. Nor were they necessarily motivated by the fact that their imperial prestige or the soul of the empire was at stake, given their previous promises to the Armenians specifically. The main reason that the European powers insisted on minority rights in the new Republic of Turkey was that by not doing so, in other words, by releasing the Turks from promising in-state minority protections, the European powers would effectively elevate the Turks to the level of the great powers. The great powers could not allow the Turks and the world to forget that they themselves were the victorious party, that they, the Allies, defeated the Turks during World War I, and that the Turks, despite their most recent victory in Anatolia, were a defeated party. Not granting anyone minority status in Turkey would render anything before 1918 prehistory, which would render the powers less than great. How come? The Allies had pushed similar minority protections in 15 other states with whom they signed post-World War I peace treaties. The conditions under which these states granted minority protections have been categorized in 3 different ways. First, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Romania, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes agreed to grant minority rights as a condition of their independence recognized or receiving extension of territory. Second category includes Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria. They were simply defeated and had not much negotiation power during the time of the signing of these treaties. I'm, of course, generalizing. Third, Albania, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Iraq, after British left in 1932, agreed to minority rights in exchange for admission to the League of Nations. The political framework used to justify these minority provisions revolved around the Wilsonian concept of self-determination. The logic was the following: people who belong outside of titular statehood can still benefit from that good, called self-determination, if they are given space to exercise their critical difference from the majority, be it race, ethnicity, language, or religion. Enjoying these liberties would be a minority's version of exercising self-determination. It was further assumed that the majority's tolerance would engender loyal minorities. The Allies thought that this was one way of preventing another total war. After all, World War I started because a Serbian guy from Bosnia, a disloyal minority member, aspired to independence from an empire that he considered, he and his people, to be an enemy of his people and their rights to determine their own way of governance, in this case, through Serbian territorial sovereignty. Let's return to 1923. All of the states on whom minority protections were imposed resented this process because they all understood what was at stake, their position in the global hierarchy of nations. This was because the Allies exempted themselves from the requirement to grant protections to their own minorities. Britain argued that it had always treated its minorities well, while France argued that it never had minorities to begin with. The unilateral nature of this process tainted the relations between the minorities and majorities. But this unilaterality was, of course, by design. By imposing minority protections on other states while exempting themselves from such provisions, the great powers communicated domination. In a way, the great powers were acting like alpha males, taming others, including Turkey, into submission. Unsurprisingly, the Turkish state and the majority found minority rights problematic precisely because they attacked their most precious currency, sovereignty. The protection of sovereignty was one of the reasons why the Turks entered World War I in the first place, as been written. It was the main reason why they had fought so hard against the dismemberment of Anatolia as provisioned in the 1920 Treaty of Sevres, which they had come to Lausanne to repudiate. When they won that military struggle, they proved themselves on the ground. From an anthropological perspective, I liken territorial sovereignty to immense potency, understood traditionally. Not having sovereignty was akin to impotency. This is one of the reasons why many in the Western world, from Iran to India, regarded the Turks as their own ideal version of a great power, a greatish Muslim underdog power who managed to rise up against the occupying West. But in fact, the reception of the Turkish delegation upon their return to Ankara from the conference was cold. The parliament did not like that the delegation in Lausanne replicated an Ottoman formula of granting extra entitlement to non-Muslims. In their view, these were not rights, but privileges. Like capitulations, they were too often exploited at the hands of aggressive Western powers, and ultimately they brought down the empire, Ottoman Empire. This resentment found its target in none other than minorities, the very groups that the provisions were supposed to protect. Turkey, like the other 15 states, breached many of these rights. The League of Nations did little in response. The League did not intervene because Turkey was now mostly recognized as a member of the family of nations by virtue of having earned its independence and sovereignty. This was also the case for other 15 states. In other words, these states might be less than great, but they were still powers or had some potential for potency. To put it crudely, they were men enough to play the game. It's not hard then to guess who was rendered feminine: the minorities. They were domesticated and given some pocket money to spend on their own wishes. Their agency was irrelevant. They came to matter to the larger world only in terms of who possessed them and who possessed the rights to them. Much like female bodies in contested zones, the bodies of minorities became a site on which men communicated with each other. But not all minorities were created equal. The bottom of the bottom belonged to those who lacked titular statehood anywhere. Jews are the ideal typical example here. Slovaks in Hungary were categorically different from Jews in Hungary because there was a state called Czechoslovakia that could at least nominally be seen as another protector of their ethnic kin elsewhere. In other words, there was actually a fourth actor in this matrix of post-World War I minorities regime in interwar Europe. Majorities, minorities, great powers, and extraterritorial states to which some minorities could in principle belong as majorities. Greeks or the Rum, who remained in post-Lausanne Turkey, are a good example of this. There was a Greece to which they could escape if the need be. How about the Armenians? Well, the Armenians. Armenia had become a Soviet republic in late 1920 as a result of being attacked by Kemalists. This early Sovietization of Armenia is worth pausing on because it was early. Other states with minorities became Soviet after World War II, for example, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Ukrainians are perhaps a comparable example to Armenians here. Both were minorities whose external homeland remained unreachable, even uncommunicable. But then, unlike Ukrainians, Armenians' minoritization was largely accomplished through genocide. As I show in my book, Recovering Armenia, the protections granted to Armenians by Turkey in the Lausanne Treaty were mere crumbs. Moreover, Turkey revoked many of these rights, especially the ones on canonical law usage is very important. Despite this, Armenians did what they could with the rights that they did have. They maximized their potential, preserved their community, and to continue to persist in Turkey to this day, despite still being largely unwanted. While I do not offer larger conclusions here, there is a moral to this story. Double standards are not good. In the aftermath of World War I, the question of minorities became a tool in a masculinist contest of who can penetrate who. In consequence, instead of restoring or distributing justice, they merely restored pre-war global hierarchies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lerna. Very, very powerful introductory moment. And I think what we should do is to come back to it after we hear the second speaker and the third speaker. The second speaker, Mustafa Aksakal, the floor is yours. If you can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So to begin, let me just say that I think what makes talking about and reflecting on the Lausanne Treaty such a powerful and compelling experience really in 2023, a century later, is the great chasm, this thunderous clap or clash between, on the one hand, the triumphant celebratory register in which Lausanne the Treaty, Lausanne the moment is held high in Turkey among ethnic Turks and Turkish Muslims, and how on the other hand, Lausanne the moment is this great moment of loss and grief and destruction, of disappointment and sadness among communities that used to be part and parcel of Ottoman society: Christian Armenians, Greek Orthodox, Ottoman Kurds, Ottoman Jews, Ottoman Arabs, and the list continues. So the loss side, by the way, of course, is beautifully, as Jay already mentioned, beautifully described and documented in the works of my colleagues here on this panel, Lerna and Len's works and Jay's work overall. So in the few minutes here, I'm going to divide my comments into two parts. The first part will relate to the century leading up to Lausanne, and the second part to the century since the treaty. So the 19th century first. The Lausanne Treaty has a 19th century history. It is not a product of only the First World War and its immediate aftermath. The treaties that followed the First World War were supposed to end military fighting and settle or define sovereignty in new ways. For the Ottoman Empire, these US European attempts to write or rewrite international collective sovereignty into the treaties, this already existed there throughout the 19th century. Most apparently, perhaps, in the treaties of 1856 Treaty of Paris that ended the Crimean War, and the 1878 Treaty of Berlin that ended the Ottoman-Russian War. But great power, or more specifically, I guess, Anglo-French, Russian, Austrian, exercised collective sovereignty in the Ottoman Eastern Mediterranean and in North Africa, and also in neighboring Iran and Morocco, had many forms and instances already throughout the century leading up to Lausanne in 1923. So I'm thinking here of Mount Lebanon in 1861, for example, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Eastern Rumelia, Cyprus, Egypt. The list continues, and each particular context, of course, was particular, down to the Armenian reform proposals of the 1890s, and again, the Armenian reform proposal of February 1914. So these are all instances of great power asserted, great power exercised, great power held, forms of sovereignty, each different in their own way, in the century leading up to Lausanne. So it was therefore perhaps no surprise that the main textbook on international law that was used at the law faculty in Istanbul in 1911 opened with Bismarck's famous quote that said, quote, "Not through speeches and majority decisions will the great questions of the day be decided, but by iron and blood," right? So this quote, famous quote by Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor, this quote actually dates back to 1862, but it carried particular relevance and significance in Istanbul in 1911 and in the pre-1914 period. So around the same time, to give another illustration, around the same time, a newspaper appearing in Izmir, Smyrna, used the following front page lead story headline. It declared that, quote, "Not by those old books of international law, but only by war." So this was expressing the view, in other words, that international law and diplomacy were a rigged game, and that only power, military muscle, really mattered. That is a lesson that, of course, not only Ottoman and later Turkish leaders drew from their experience with European, US, and Japanese power, but political and military leaders and revolutionaries the world over. During the First World War, Ottoman leaders talked about fighting the war in order to, quote, "rip up the treaties of Paris and Berlin that had, they believed, so undermined, so stunted their sovereignty." And so all throughout the Ottoman lands, European powers asserted sovereignty already in the century before Lausanne through legal and financial instruments, which they gave up only in 1923, only in part, and which were greatly contested during the entire negotiation process. Okay, so I'll now move on to the post-1923 period. Here, what strikes me as the most salient feature is that the Lausanne Treaty gave us a world that is even less well-equipped to handle ethnic and religious difference than the pre-1914 world. And I say that, of course, without any great sense of nostalgia. The Ottoman Empire in 1914 was in great need of political and institutional reform. There's no question about that, even after decades of reforms already. But whereas those reforms were on the agenda before 1914, After 1923, of course, they disappeared entirely. What Lausanne also has done has been to erase the history and memory of this pre-1914 world, Ottoman world in Turkey today. So I want to give you two quick examples of the passing of this world. During the war between Greece and the Ottoman Empire in 1919-1922, and I say Ottoman Empire rather than Turkey here, between 1919 and 1922, Dimitra, a Greek Orthodox woman, met with Sabahattin, the Ottoman opposition leader during the war. In 1923, Dimitra wrote a letter to Sabahattin about their meeting. Among other things, she notes, she says to Sabahattin, "We met when the army of your race and that of mine were clashing on the battlefield. Yet there was no prejudice, no antagonism, no hatred between us. You knew me to be a Greek by blood and born in Turkey. Yet you accepted me as Ottomans should each other, as children of the same empire," end quote. And then she goes on to lay out a vision of how the pre-1914 world might have been preserved. So contemporaries did not categorically reject coexistence, in other words. Nor was this true only for members of the elite. So Dimitra was a very educated woman. Sabahattin is the member of actually the royal family in exile who led much of the opposition during the First World War. But I want to make the point that this was hardly simply an example or a notion, a culture that existed among members of the elite. The scholar Nora Lesserson relates the story of her great-grandfather, Panos, an Ottoman Armenian Christian who owned and operated a barbershop. And he owned and operated this barbershop with his partner Hussein, an Ottoman Turkish Muslim. The clientele of the barbershop was clearly a space, or the barbershop itself and its clientele were spaces and places of everyday intercommunal life in the empire. During the First World War, Panos was deported. When he returned 3.5 years later, his partner Hussein had put away half the profits that had accumulated, that had collected in Panos's absence, and he had saved these profits for Panos, and he gave him these profits, his share. So these stories are not simply rosy depictions of intercommunal life, but they make clear that both oppression and friendship shaped and defined this world before 1914. But here is my concluding point, and here's the key really. Contemporaries lived and breathed the potential of this coexistence. It's that potential that was buried at Lausanne and that today has been largely forgotten. Thank you. I'll stop there and I'll save other comments for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Father. Very important end point that we will pick up again. Len, the floor is yours.
Great. I unmuted myself successfully.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I'd like to thank you all for including me. I'm very, very happy to be here. And I think what I'm going to say actually dovetails nicely with what Lerna said and what Mustafa said. I'm going to focus on a particular aspect of the Treaty of Lausanne, the population exchange between the Greeks and the Turks. And what I'm going to argue is that this, the convention attached to the Treaty of Lausanne, providing for this exchange, in a way constitutes the culmination of a whole process that established the exclusive right of the state to determine who did and who did not belong to the national community. and that there were actually two population exchanges that resulted from peacemaking after the First World War. One between the Greeks and the Bulgarians, the other between the Greeks and the Turks. And I'm going to argue that they have to be seen in tandem. And through conventions attached to these two treaties, the Treaty of Neuilly, signed with Bulgaria in November 1919, and the Treaty of Lausanne of July 1923, this right of the sovereign state to determine who and who did not belong became recognized and accepted facets of international law. Now, these population exchanges took the political and legal forms they did because of a convergence of the international system and international law. Successor states sovereignty wanted to maximize both ethnic and historic boundaries. And I find Lerna's observation of state sovereignty as having something inherently masculine about it, a compelling way of thinking about this here, and about determining the absolute right to determine belonging in the national community. Now, for their part, the other side of the equation, though, was the great powers. The great powers needed to close down peacemaking, particularly with Turkey, in the wake of what was in effect a lost proxy war between Greece and the new regime in Anatolia. So the population exchanges were the last and the most ruthless attempt to separate peoples into ethno-national states. Nothing to that point had, and I use this in quotes, worked. Trying to draw boundaries that would suit peoples, plebiscites, minority treaties, all to the peacemakers seemed to create as many problems as they sought to solve. None of these simplified matters for the great powers. So through the population exchanges, belonging was shifted to the hands of the successor states with the formal approval of the international system. Now, first, very briefly to the Greek-Bulgarian exchange, the so-called voluntary exchange. The Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria was imposed on a defeated Central Power by the Paris Peace Conference. The resulting convention, as I indicated, provided for a quote-unquote voluntary exchange. Individuals were allowed to decide their own ethnicity according to their own criteria. The use of language was problematic everywhere because Christians, Muslims often spoke Greek, Bulgarian, Turkish, Lord only knows what else. Voluntary, in quotes, migration meant that adult men would declare the intention to emigrate to mixed commissions. These mixed commissions would comprise one Greek, one Bulgarian, and two persons of neither nationality designated by the League of Nations. This was, by the way, completely gendered nationality. Men would declare on behalf of their wives and their minor children. But the mixed commissions were supposed to serve as honest brokers of persons and goods. Well, real life matters were not, however, so simple, and which made the whole concept of voluntary exchange very problematic. There was nothing in the convention that would prevent either Greek or Bulgarian governments from exercising pressure or outright coercion in favor of migration. I mean, even in the absence of coercion, Greek-speaking Bulgarians and Bulgarian-speaking Greeks could face an unappealing choice. They could self-identify as minorities in countries that had expressed a public preference that they leave. Or they could become, in effect, refugees, strangers in new lands, often with resentful neighbors with whom they happen to share a common language or a common religion. Indeed, so formidable were the obstacles to a so-called voluntary exchange that allied distancing from the whole concept began right away. And the issue involved whether signing the Treaty of Neuilly meant accepting responsibility for the exchange. Now, Alan Dulles of the American delegation ultimately came up with an acceptable solution. His argument was that the exchange took place under the aegis and guidance of the League of Nations and thus could be relegated to a separate convention signed only by Greece and Bulgaria. And this precedent was particularly important when it came to the Greek-Turkish exchange. In the event, the Greek-Bulgarian exchange proved messy and incomplete. Greeks actually encouraged the migration of former Bulgarians who considered themselves Greek in order to populate new Greek territories in Macedonia and Thrace. The Bulgarian government, on the other hand, encouraged Bulgarians in Greece to remain in Greece in hopes of border revision later on. So as late as the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne, only 197 Greek families and 166 Bulgarian families had registered a desire to emigrate. The situation became more complicated after the burning of Smyrna, today Izmir, in September 1922, where thousands of terrified Greeks fled Anatolia. To make room for them, the Greek government began forcibly to remove Bulgarians, particularly in Thrace, and the Bulgarian government responded in kind by removing people they considered Greek. By the end of 1925, over 150,000 people had registered declarations to mixed commissions, another 80,000 without using the commissions, many Bulgarians who hoped to return. But even so, substantial populations remained. An estimated 140,000 Bulgarians remained in Greece, and estimated 12,000 Greeks in Bulgaria. So the moral of the story, according to the logic of peacemaking at the time, was that a voluntary exchange was a messy exchange, was an incomplete exchange, and was not necessarily all that voluntary. So on then to the Greek-Turkish exchange proper, provided for in the Treaty of Lausanne. The world had changed a great deal between the Treaty of Neuilly and the Treaty of Lausanne. The Paris Peace Conference ground onward into 1919 and 1920. It produced the Treaty of Sèvres, signed with the regime of the Sultan in August 1920. It was increasingly clear, however, that though the treaty had been signed with the Sultan, effective sovereignty in Anatolia was shifting to the new regime led by Mustafa Kemal. Greek incursions, encouraged by the Allies, led to a renewed war, in effect a proxy war between the British and the French and the new regime in Turkey. The Çanak crisis of the fall of 1922 affirmed that Greeks, British, and French had all lost this war. The French were making their own arrangements with the Kemalist regime, not least to stabilize the situation in their new League of Nations mandate in Syria. The French also held a huge Ottoman debt, which they wanted to regularize. The Çanak crisis had fragmented the unity of the British Empire itself, as the dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, refused to send military support as the British situation deteriorated. The British further needed to stabilize their new mandate in Iraq prior to resolving the knottiest problem, the disposition of Mosul. The successor states had their own interest in the matter. Greece, strictly speaking, was not a successor state because it existed before 1914, but it had gained substantial new territories along with substantial new populations and was in many ways treated as a successor state. The new regime in Turkey had to stabilize and legitimize itself, and I would argue had an interest in what political scientists call socializing itself in the post-war international system, and further to create what it saw as an authentic Turkish Turkey. All of this, of course, led to a new peace conference in Lausanne, which is what we're all doing here. The Treaty of Lausanne, as my colleagues have said, was not written by the Allies and imposed on the defeated power. It was written according to its own logic, its own conference, and can be seen, I would argue, as the new regime in Turkey and the international system still led, but not really ruled by the great powers, learning to recognize each other, a new regime and an evolving system recognizing each other. Like the Greek-Bulgarian exchange, the Greek-Turkish exchange was outlined in a convention appended to the Treaty of Lausanne. Only the Greek and Turkish governments signed it. Exchange was now compulsory. As my colleagues noted, there was a single criteria, religion, that would determine ethnicity. Christians are Greek, Muslims are Turks. Other abstractions, national spirit, political loyalty, even culture, language, were not factors. Above all, ethnicity could no longer be a matter of personal choice. The mixed commissions became instruments for sorting this out, for determining who and who was not subject to exchange, and for the division of property. These commissions comprised 4 Greeks, 4 Turks, and 3 members named by the League. Now, this further implicated the League in the exchange, okay, because of the League members on the commissions. And there were cases when the Court of International Justice came into being, there were cases involving the exchange that ground on into the early 1930s. Now, uncontroversial numbers are hard to come by, but certainly the Greek-Turkish exchange was of a different magnitude from the Greek-Bulgarian exchange. And further, because of the war, it's actually difficult to tell migrants from refugees. But sort of going numbers, and maybe Lerna and Mustafa have better insight on, and Jay have better insight onto this than I do. The number I've sort of worked with is maybe 300,000 people affected by the Greek-Bulgarian exchange, 1.6 million by the Greek-Turkish exchange. Now, because of all the baggage attached to it, a remarkable amount of time in Lausanne went into avoiding taking responsibility for the exchange and finding someone else other than oneself to blame for the exchange. A common argument today is that most everyone at Lausanne wanted a compulsory exchange, provided they could blame it on someone else: the Greeks, the Turkish, the British, the French, and on and on. So this fixation on blame took place at the Lausanne Conference, rivers of tears of debatable sincerity. The Turkish delegation fixated on aggression since the time of the Balkan Wars, and the quote unmixing of these populations were simply complementing the expulsion of Turks from the Balkans from the previous century. The Greek delegation, led by Eleftherios Venizelos, called the idea of a compulsory exchange repugnant. Most famously, Lord Curzon of Britain claimed that he, quote, deeply regretted a compulsory exchange, referring to it, quote, as a thoroughly bad and vicious solution for which the world would pay a heavy penalty for 100 years to come, unquote. Nevertheless, he signed. The French by this time were preoccupied with Cilicia and Syria, and many found it convenient, both at the time and subsequently, to blame Fridtjof Nansen, the League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, hitherto a famous humanitarian who could now be sort of all things lamentable to all people in the matter. And so the convention was signed, providing for the exchange, and was put into effect. Well, what are the takeaways that I hope are of relevance here? One is that the making of international law is not so much a codification of right and wrong, so much as the result of the political processes of international relations. Second, self-determination by the Treaty of Lausanne had come to mean successor state interest. This was the self worthy of determination, the self of the successor state itself. Most importantly, the state was affirmed as the master of its own population within internationally recognized borders. Okay. Partial exceptions were for humanitarian efforts of international organizations such as the League or today the United Nations. But even that exception largely depended on the internal strength of the state. And there are any numbers of examples after 1945. Eastern Europe, particularly the expulsion of German populations from Eastern Europe after 1945, India and Pakistan, ex-Yugoslavia, Burma after 2017, or one could argue the Uyghurs of China today. Okay. In other words, and generally speaking, in matters of regulating population and determining the identity of population within recognized boundaries, international theatrics might be the variable. International acceptance of what states do has been the constant. Okay. So I'll leave it there and we can turn ourselves to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Len. What I propose to do is to raise a couple of points which might reflect on different lines of argument that we've heard today, and maybe add a few more that haven't been mentioned. The first of them seems to me to be that Lausanne was a product of imperial weakness, not imperial strength. And the weakness was economic. It wasn't primarily political. These were countries that couldn't establish lines of supply to keep in the field or indeed nearby armies sufficiently large to establish their right to work out what the outcome of the Turkish victory in 1922 would be. The only army in the field was the Turkish army of the Grand National Assembly. And it is similar to what you just said, Len. I think the notion of power is, I think, fluid in Lausanne to such a point that Curzon didn't sign the peace treaty. He was dying. It was, in many respects, a humiliation for Britain and France to be put in this position. And the person who proved my point was Benito Mussolini, the new man on the block, who within days of the signing of the peace treaty decided to pull his Corfu caper and further humiliate the Greek government and the League of Nations. And that's where I'm interested, Lerna, in perhaps drawing you out further. I think Lausanne is an example of masculine impotence on the part of posturing and strutting peacocks who had run the imperial order before. And the people who really knew about penetration and male fantasies picked up the lesson. That was the Nazis, who began their, shall we say, march, interrupted, no doubt, or crooked march to power within 6 months of Lausanne. So my interpretation of your gendered argument, Lerna, is that it can be turned upside down. That it's a story of the beginning of the end of empire in a way that has 40 years to run its course. It's not at all a direct line, and I wouldn't claim that for a moment. But I'd like to put to you the point that it seems to me that there's something radically different in the way in which Britain and France operated the diplomatic game in 1922 and 1923 at Lausanne, and the way they operated multiple conflicts before. We do know from extensive correspondence that Poincaré simply couldn't stand being in the same room as Curzon. The great powers do not exist anymore as a, what would you call it, as a front. And Mussolini, even though he tried to establish the importance of photo opportunities right at the beginning of the conference, where he shows up and then demands that Poincaré and Curzon go and meet him in another place. But the rules of the game, I think, and here's a point I would put to you, Len, I think have made 1913 irrelevant. 1913 and 1923 seem to me to be in different worlds of power. And I'll use, I will engage you in that order. I think in a way, Mustafa, isn't this along the lines of your own argument? Of course, there were continuities, but I think one of the radical positions that we have to accept, and here is part of the argument of Hans Lucas Kieser that I accept, and it is Carl Schmitt's argument. He wrote his famous political theology in 1922 at the time of the Lausanne conference, during the Lausanne conference, establishing that the sovereign is he who can establish, who can fix the state of exception. Now, here's the question I put to you. The state of exception, I think, in every warring country started in 1914, and it continued long after 1918. State of exception was a way of operating warfare without worrying about civilian casualties. Indeed, one might even argue without worrying about military casualties, because if you keep a parliament quiet, you will keep public opinion where it should be in these days, which is on your side, or else entirely without force. So what I'd like to put to the three of you is what I tried to argue in my book, that something radical had happened between 1914 and 1923 that made Lausanne possible. And it's a series of ratcheting up, or ratcheting down, if you will, of the obstacles to the targeting of civilians as the primary focus of military and political activity. Not necessarily, of course, they had been targeted long time before, but I do think the Armenian genocide is a radical departure from earlier forms of persecution and murder. But I'm not sure, Lerna, you know the archives much better than I do, whether you would share that view, that something between 1914 and 1918 had happened in such a way as to produce what I call the civilianization of war. The last point I wanted to raise on this is very simple. If you want to see what the civilianization of war meant, you should go somewhere we haven't mentioned but should have. You should go to Ukraine. And I'm talking about Ukraine in 1919. What Putin is doing now is returning to the war against Ukraine in 1919. And the way that I feel about this is, once again, limited. There are scholars who know this field much better than I do. My colleague Tim Snyder can speak to this in a way that I can't. But I keep wondering whether the person who really understood the period we're talking about most powerfully is Pasternak and Dr. Zhivago. Zhivago is the novel of the civilianization of war, that the revolution is an opening of the gates of violence that is totally uncontrolled. And who are the targets? The targets are civilians. In Lausanne is something I wish I had added to my book, and I hope to write about it a little bit later. We have to talk about the elephant in the room, namely the Bolshevik Revolution, and the extent to which the Bolshevik Revolution had its own theory of self-determination. They have their story to tell. It's not the story that the West wants to hear at all, but it's there. And it's there in such a way, as you said, Lerna, to have consolidated its power in the Caucasus to the detriment of any possibility of the Armenians becoming full participants in the conference at Lausanne in 1922 and 1923. So I'd like to ask the three of you whether you agree with me, first, that something radical happened between 14 and 18 to make the pre-war and the post-war periods, shall we say, develop in different dimensions. And the second is to say, to what extent is the outcome of Lausanne an imperial disaster, an imperial failure, and one that could not possibly be accommodated by those who thought they held power. And what does Mussolini do after Corfu? He decides to get his own empire, to turn away from the foreign policy of Italy for the previous 20 years and find a Mare Nostrum all by himself. Why? Because the old men are weak. They can't penetrate anybody. Curzon couldn't become prime minister. All of the gendered images, Lerna, that you've used, I think are very strong and very apposite. But I think they work in the direction of impotence as well as in the direction of projecting power. So these are the suggestions that I want to put in about discontinuity, and I'd be very happy to hear from any of the three who might want to start. Lerna, please. You have to unmute. Unmute.
Sorry. I agree with you, Jay. Thank you. It's just a lens, right? And because they are weak, they are trying to prove their potency, right?
Yes. Yes.
If they were confident, and I don't know when it started keeping Mustafa's points about the mid-19th century in mind, but definitely the exercise itself is to prove that they are still at the top of their game, at the top of the whole. They set the rules. This is how I read it. Do you read it this way? Also, specifically in this reading, for me, it's from the minority protection impositions.
Yes.
Like how that relationship is mediated between some powers who are trying to sustain their greatness and project that greatness, and they have some tools. They have failed on the ground, especially because the military, as you said, they don't have supply lines. Like they are super emasculated previously, right? The man is the Turk at that moment when they come together, despite Ismet's shortness, deafness, still a general though, with his bodyguard making an entrance really to Lausanne. But they still had to be, they still at the end couldn't get away with not granting these protections to the minorities, which was the way for but yeah, they accepted being less than great and therefore less than masculine a little bit. So Mussolini, I think it's a very great point. I take this as the right type of like criticism, because of course the three of them British friends, they are very different, and the Italians different things are happening. Yeah, and I'll leave it there. It's a Corfu case, which I know you also talked about in one of the previous seminars on this platform, is a super interesting case. Especially, I know what happens to the Armenians in Corfu who escaped to Corfu after the exodus from Anatolia, and now they are being bombed by the Italians who are against Greece. I'll leave it there. The last one is the I think Mustafa will respond to this more than I do, but how drastically different the years of war were. I mean, because it's a genocide, they are drastically different. I mean, there's no question that it's different from the Hamidian massacres. What happens to Armenians is different from disciplinary violence, communicative violence that previously were used by different rulers. This doesn't necessarily lead, however, to the potentiality, at least, of still being able to imagine a life together in the aftermath. Like, these things both can be true.
Yes.
I mean, to this day in Turkey, after all these pogroms, post-1923, post-1955, around 2007, assassination of an Armenian Turkish journalist in broad daylight, we can still think and imagine and believe in a certain kind of more or less equal horizontal coexistence. So it's if genocide were the end of it, they would have won more.
Thank you. Mustafa, would you like to add your voice?
Yeah, thank you for those comments and questions. I mean, I think Jay, in some ways you're asking about one of the most difficult questions to ask, I think, from the perspective of the field of Ottoman history, of what motivated the Young Turk regime, where do motivations come from? I would not disagree at all with your assertion that the Committee of Union and Progress, the Young Turk, that they resorted in an unprecedented way to tools of destroying a population whom they consider to be a political threat. I would agree with that. But I do think that there is so much continuity in front of the Young Turks in terms of what France is doing in Algeria, starving a third of the population in the second half of the 19th century, what the United States is doing in North America. And I'm not playing this game here of pointing fingers of who did what worse. It's not about that, but it's about thinking about 1914 and trying to understand what meant modern statecraft, what meant modern empire, what were the examples set by the great powers. The behavior of great powers in the late 19th, I mean, Caroline Elkins' book, The Legacy of Violence, have incredible quotes, just to look in one place for the audience, but by Churchill, for example, right, of how to burn down villages in Afghanistan, right? Or these even continue after the First World War in British, that Priya Satya has written about the way British policy is implemented in terms of air power in Iraq, right, in the 1920s. that is the context, and that is the world, I think, in which the Committee of Union and Progress, in which this regime is situating and locating itself. And those are the points of orientation. So this is not in any way to say that it's not just coming from their sort of their internal world of racism and nationalism and religious identity or zeal. It's coming from, and I don't think on this point I'm saying anything that would be controversial among scholars of the late Ottoman Empire. They're responding to a global world of empire and colonialism. You know, Frantz Fanon, for example, writing a couple of decades later, but writes about how these anti-colonial movements become more violent, more oppressive, and how this turns into fratricide in so many cases. Albert Memmi writes about this, right? How anti-colonialism becomes this boomerang and how violent these are. So I think it's really important to take that 19th century, to me, understanding the genocide, understanding Lausanne without the deep 19th century context is really not, it doesn't really make sense to me. It's also a rejection in 1914, 1915, I think, by this regime of the idea that you can actually engage with diplomacy and European norms. And that, I think, in some ways is only proven in the 1920s by how the League of Nations, and Len has written about that, how the League of, and so many have written about this here, how the League of Nations deals with the Arab mandates, right? Complete denial of individual liberal rights and sovereignty. And that has given us the Middle East, where military dictatorship and military security is paramount and is prioritized over any kind of other objectives. So I think this point about continuity, while yes, the 1915 is in many ways it's unique, it's exceptional, but it comes out of this context of colonial oppression that in a way sets the standard for the Young Turks. So and this is, I think, where I disagree with Hans Lucas Kieser's most recent work, that somehow it comes out of, you know, Zia Gökalp and this violence. And I think, you know, they inhabit a world that is so European, that is so American, that is so, dare I say, modern, right? And yet it is so destructive and violent and anti-democratic.
Thank you, Mustafa. Len.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just pick up on a piece of what you were saying, Jay. And I was struck by when you were talking that, you know, like me, Jay, your background is in European history. That was your original training. And I think for those of us whose background is in European history, what impresses us is not the strength of the Allies at Lausanne, but their weakness. And one, that this is certainly not, the victory itself of 1918 is becoming undone. And this is simply one of the more obvious examples of that. It's not a total victory. And the Allies aren't really the Allies anymore. The Chanak crisis was an earthquake in British domestic politics. It gets rid of Lloyd George. It hastens the demise of the Liberal Party. It's an earthquake domestically. It's also in imperial terms. The Dominions said, no, we're not going. The Kemalist forces are closing in on Çanakkale, and Britain asked for help. The Dominions say no. Well, if an empire can't command its constituent parts, in what sense is it an empire? The French are, I mean, I think that their perspective is both narrowing and intensifying. I mean, the French fixation on Syria/Lebanon and kind of making this a viable part of the French Empire, whether you call it a mandate or whatever you call it, can scarcely be exaggerated. And I think it kind of begins this frantic effort to reinvent the French Empire because it doesn't trust its own allies, and it's desperately afraid that in the long run it will be weaker than Germany. I think the French see their empire as one of the few cards they have to play in trying to re-establish the position of France as a great power. And I think Syria is one venue where this takes place. It's
Yes.
dubious strategic, let alone its economic value to France notwithstanding.
Yes.
I think Syria is just in some ways kind of the opening round of this fixation of the French on reinventing their empire in ways that could be extremely brutal,
Yes.
So,
Yes.
and that indicates not French imperial strength, but French imperial weakness.
Yeah. Yes. Thank
Terror
you.
is a tactic of the weak. It is not a
Yes.
tactic of the strong.
I think that's a very powerful point. Let me just try to tie 2 points together. One of which I don't think we've had a chance to talk about it, and I haven't heard about it as a central theme in other discussions. The first point, Lerna, you point out how the assassination, of a journalist in 2007, even that didn't destroy the dream of coexistence and, shall we say, brotherhood. Is it the case that the genocide proved, and maybe the Holocaust afterwards, that whoever invented the term unmixing, and I think it was Noel Baker, that's my guess. If you want to take the load off of Nansen, use his assistant. He's a good labor peer, and Nobel Peace Prize winner, and an Olympic champion at the same time. I forget what it was 400 meters. I forgot what he won in the Olympics. Whoever invented that word, I think, was a fool. Not a moral, it was a moral menace to talk about the unmixing of the population. But the very idea that you could remove the Armenian presence from Anatolia by murdering 1,500,000 people was proven wrong, just as the Holocaust proved that you couldn't remove the Jewish stain on European culture by murdering 6 million people. There's something about the failure of Lausanne in the Zygmunt Bauman sense. The idea, what you said, Mustafa, that it's very modern. Well, Bauman thought that the height, as it were, the epitome of modernity was the Holocaust. That the modern idea that you could weed the garden of humanity, you could take out the weeds and leave only the flowers, is a catastrophic mistake, not only in biological terms, obviously in political ones too. That this is the first thing I wanted to raise. But the second thing is I think more difficult for me, and I here would like instruction. Why is the destruction of Kurdish hopes for a homeland not more prominent in the discussion of Lausanne? Lausanne, of course, removed, and I've written about this, the Armenian dream, and it did so in a direct and humiliating way, in a public way. But what about Kurdistan? Why is it that the equivalent humiliation and exclusion of the Kurdish people from the idea that they could actually be a people without a state, are they not among the largest stateless population in the world today? They're one of the large populations of stateless people. It depends how you think of Palestinians. But I'd like to ask all three of you, how was it that the problem of Kurdistan has been so successfully buried? Even though scholarship in recent years, I would imagine, has helped to uncover the story more generally, I'd like to know further about the Kurdish problem and its fate post-Lausanne. Lerna, please, could you help?
I don't know how much I can help, but regarding the Armenian genocide, its goal is not the end of coexistence. Its goal is to prevent Armenians from having a state of their own.
Which they succeeded, yes.
Which they succeeded. It's a very successful genocide. And no genocide is ever final in eliminating every living being that belongs to the target group forever, right? But it's a way of resisting the idea of any genocide being able to categorize as successful, to still be able to imagine coexistence as not even idealized nostalgic way, but just being able to live with your neighbor that is different from you, but without tolerating that difference, but with respecting that difference, appreciating that difference, maybe. That is a way that this is why it's part of me being using my historical knowledge and my personal background as a way to be a better citizen of the world, that I ended my last comment like that. Like, despite that genocide, coexistence is possible. It's not because they hope that there would never be any Armenians online, because they would know that also there is a lot of conversion, forced conversion to Islam, which they must have thought that will not remain the end of those people's identities forever, right? So anyway, so that's that. Kurds. I knew this was going to come. It was part of my thinking in terms of gender, like, where do I put the Kurds now? Because if there are some people who are trying to be men enough, then there are others who are also trying, but kind of a little bit domesticated, has to be like kind of submitted to the wannabe alpha males. And if the minorities are the females of this, who are the Turks? Kurds. Does anyone have a guess? Who would be the Kurd? I thought maybe like gays, like homosexual men. They are rendered, like they could have played the game, but they are not given the right whatsoever, because they were not genocided. The biggest difference at the end is that they have perpetrated, they're part of the perpetrating group of this, right? So that's why post factum, thinking of Armenians and Kurds similarly, because they both had some kind of autonomy in the Sevres Treaty or independence with some referendum conditions. And then looking back from today and thinking of them as yet another stateless group is not valid, simply because they were part of the majority. They fought this fight together with other Muslims to render Anatolia, part of at least Anatolia, without Armenians. And they have so much to gain to keep this, to not let Armenians, for instance, to have even autonomy within Turkey, within the new Turkey, because that's where they live. What's going to happen to them if Armenians make a comeback out of debt, because they don't even have enough numbers at that point, right? They would have to give back the properties that they stole, women and children that they literally stole. So that's part. And also, I think there's a lot of, I know some Kurdish scholars now, and they don't like this term, but there is really a lot of fragmentation amongst Kurdish leadership, right? Because they are a huge group. They have sustained their numbers. They have a lot of friction. So different groups want different things and align themselves with different people at different processes. Like, unlike Armenians, it's one of the weird consequences of genocide that they are unified in the moment of post-genocide, at least for the first year in 1919, with one particular goal, regardless of all that fraction before, political and otherwise. They want their state. They accuse the Turks of doing all these things. Kurds never have it, simply because they weren't attacked by that until that time as Kurds en masse in a similar way. That's it.
Thank you.
Could I add one?
Yes,
piece
Len.
to that? A few weeks ago, I was in Lausanne at a conference sponsored by the Institut Kurd, the Kurdish Institute of Paris, and at least the people at that conference, the Kurds were still divided. They were not on the same page. I don't know. I mean, something that can be added to this, and I think maybe dovetails onto what Lerna was saying. I think there's a geographic element of this. Who is going to create or guarantee Kurdistan? Everybody had their own space. The Turks want an ethno-national state within certain borders. The British want Mosul. The French are obsessed with Syria. There are Kurds in all of these places, but lots of powerful entities have a stake in guaranteeing a certain kind of sovereignty over these geographic spaces. I mean, who is there to provide the geopolitical, let alone the military muscle for a Kurdistan? So maybe that's a kind of a partial answer to Jay's question.
Well, isn't there a silent story being told, and namely it's the state of Israel that's doing the job right now, but not in the public domain. It's doing
Well,
it.
I mean, the Israelis had Harry Truman.
Sorry?
You know, I mean, the Israelis had Harry Truman.
No, I'm talking about Israelis in Kurdistan now, today. I'm talking about a series of very probably clever diplomatic moves to divide and conquer yet again, to make sure that the ills of the region become the defense of the permanent hegemony of the nuclear power in the Middle East. I'm not talking about 1948. I'm talking about now. Mustafa, would you like to perhaps, I really open this because I have been interested in seeing how to trace the line, the broken line between Sèvres and Lausanne. Kurdistan, or at least a Kurdish project, exists in the first and it vanishes from the second. How would you explain that disappearance?
Well, I think, I mean, in some ways, I think among, within the field, there's specialists. I think that the story of Kurds at Lausanne, the story is known among scholars, among specialists, but not very much, but it's not very well known beyond scholars. But I would say also that in a way it's not the disappearance, it's the fact that the Armenian history have developed in leaps and bounds in the last 20 years, and that Kurdish history have not done that in the same way. I would say that until 20 years ago or so, the Armenian story was perhaps just as clouded as the Kurdish story is today. Not among specialists, but I think beyond that circle. That would be my my response to that. But I also want to say that I think the Kurdish experience during the First World War, as Uğur Üngör has shown in his book, that Kurds clearly were also targeted during the war as a population and deported, and also with the goal of sort of breaking down the density and concentration of Kurdish populations in Eastern Anatolia. And then in 1919, it has been pointed out, there was clearly an alliance between Turks and Kurds, and that this alliance very much turned on the idea that if Armenians come back, then those Kurdish groups that had benefited from the genocide would have to either return land, possessions, or would have to be made to pay for their participation in it. So I think it's a very complex story that I think scholars and specialists certainly are working on, but it's not easily told or very well known. But I think future scholars will change that, and young scholars are very much working on this. We were at a conference a few weeks ago where there's a whole group of younger scholars completing PhD dissertations now, recently completed, who I think will have much to say on this point, and they will weigh in on this conversation before too long.
Thank you. Sumava, I'd like to suggest that if there are any questions that our participants who have been silent partners in this discussion want to ask questions, now would be a time to do so. And you can tell me if there are any hands up or any question and answer queries that have come your way.
Yeah, so maybe I can ask a question since Professor Lerna and Professor Len already mentioned about this, the analogy of the India-Pakistan refugees. So I just wanted to know, with respect to the decision of population exchange between Anatolia and Greece as a part of imperial project, and so is there any material evidence to claim that the India-Pakistan and the division of the subcontinent was informed or provided by the genesis of the Treaty of Lausanne? So yeah.
I'll let Len speak
Lerna,
to this.
please.
No, I'm not going to speak about this, but Len, but I love the question. I have been wondering this question myself for a long time, because we keep using, this is the line in the literature really, that it has been used as an example for other things.
Yes.
But then which other things and how specifically? We know that Zionists, definitely interwar era Zionists, use this as a project, as a good idea possibly of
it's not over.
the Palestinian. Yeah, I mean, it's not
over. Benny Morris has picked it up again. It's alive and kicking.
Yes.
Would you accept, Lerna, the possibility that the uncomfortable conduit are the Nazis? That even though it would never be admitted as British imperial policy, but everyone knew what had happened 3 years before the partition of India. It didn't have to be said. Radical population, let's put it, biopolitics was practiced on the grand scale in everybody's vision, in everybody's field of vision, in such a way as to make, and here I agree that the study of Kenya and the British Empire, those who watch the Nazis aren't necessarily going to become Nazis by using Nazi policies. They're simply good imperialists.
But biopolitics was there before too, right?
Yes,
before you don't need the Greek-Turkish exchange of populations to be able to devise a plan like that, which then brings me to ask, Len, why do you think everyone was so upset? I mean, at least performatively, why were they performing to be regretting this decision that they had to make? Like, I think they are kind of connected. Because they knew that previously they did this and it wasn't good, probably, right?
Sure. But I think maybe as some kind of cover for its absurdity. I mean, what about Albanians? And what about people who don't? And they had to make exceptions, right? They accepted the Greeks of Istanbul, and no racial policy. I mean, it's hard to imagine a racial policy that is completely airtight. And this is certainly a part of that. I mean, as far as India-Pakistan, I knew when I mentioned India-Pakistan that I was mentioning something that I really didn't know very much about. I mean, I think what Lausanne helped foster was the idea of unmixing itself. Unmixing is an absurd concept, because it means that people have to have a clear pre-existing identity in order to be unmixed, which of course they don't. And so what I think the population exchange after Lausanne did was perversely reinforce unmixing or forced unmixing as a viable solution. And it's not just the Holocaust, by the way, it's the expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe after 45, and the French had elaborate criteria. They had a whole triage system of how German you were, which would determine whether you were to be expelled from Alsace and Lorraine. This wasn't just some, Red Army, thing that was going on, So I guess if asked to identify the link between Lausanne and India-Pakistan, I would say it's a doubling down on this concept that peoples can be unmixed. I mean, they're not unmixed, they're remixed. There was one mixing before this happened. There was another mixing after it happened, but they're still mixed.
Well, what I would like to suggest now is for our three panelists to add any phrases or sentences that they would like about if we had to make a gesture on Monday morning about Lausanne, would it be a black day? I would say that's how I would treat it. I see it as a disaster. But I don't know if that is shared among our panelists. Len, what do you think? Was it a disaster?
I don't know. I mean, perhaps I've become more fatalistic as a historian with age. I mean, I don't, I mean, idealism was so dead and gone by 1923, and whatever, you know, Wilson's what, either dead or practically dead, and Wilsonianism had certainly morphed into 1,000 other different things over which Wilsonians had no more control. I mean, the people really kind of pushing out the ideological boundary at this point are the fascists. I mean, there are people attempting to reinvent ideology as something that shapes geopolitics. I guess, I don't know. I mean, I'm a little hesitant to go, you know, to think of this in kind of binary black and white terms. I guess I'd call it an awfully dark gray, though.
I hear you,
No,
Lerna.
no.
What would you feel?
It could have been worse. It's not ideal, and especially from the perspective of minority protections. I did provide a negative view, more or less, of the minority protections, which was, for instance, not the kind of reading that I provided when Mustafa and I were at the Chicago conference, Northwestern conference. Mm-hmm. Meaning, actually, I'm so glad these minority protections were pushed on Turkey. Yes, it did lead to some kind of negative perceptions of minorities as the continued enemy within West's extension within the Turkish space. But I think without even the minority protections, there would be that mark on the minorities, given what happened from 1919 to 1923. And thanks to those minority protections, despite all the breaches of the Turkish state, still to this day, there are minority schools in Turkey, Greek, Armenian, and Jewish. They have some sort of autonomy. It's supremely regulated by the Ministry of Education, the schools, but this is where you can go and learn the Armenian language, Western Armenian, which is categorized by UNESCO as a nearly extinct language. There is liberty, there is religious, more or less religious liberty still in Turkey, thanks to these protections. Some charitable organizations exist. And I'm grateful for that.
Thank you. That's a very powerful argument. Mustafa, the last word is yours.
So I completely agree with Lerna's point that she just made in terms of looking from 1923 forward, that these rules were imposed on the Turkish Republic. I think that was better than not having them. I agree 100%. I do want to, I think this is crucial, that when we started the 19th century, right, or it's all throughout the 19th century, that communities in the Ottoman Empire had these rights already, and that there was a legal pluralism. There was a legal pluralist culture in the Ottoman Empire. And I'm not saying that was a product of notions of tolerance or coexistence. It's just how pre-modern empires were transitioning into modern empires. But it is crucial to remember that legal pluralism was destroyed through interaction with, in many ways, British and French power, who insisted on the fact that as long as there is this kind of legal chaos in the Ottoman Empire, that European powers have the right to have extraterritorial rights and to expand the capitulations. And this, not only in the Ottoman Empire, but in other places around the world, led states to homogenize, to standardize, to create a single legal culture that was very damaging in terms of accommodating and managing various communities in a single polity. And so there was a legal pluralism that was destroyed. And then what we have in 1923 is some kind of reimposed residual sort of product of that. And I think that is a great tragedy, that is the history of those rights. But they start, I think, in the 19th century. And to me, they don't really make sense to think about them without that. It's not that they're that legal pluralism is introduced there from the outside.
No, I think, Len, you're one of the points of your book is that minority rights are whatever sovereign states say they are, and nothing more than that. So they're this.
The cynic
is
in
that a
me
correct reading of your book?
Right. I mean, the cynic in me wonders if the Turks aren't looking at the Poles and saying, sure, we'll sign, we'll take it as seriously as we'll take minority protections as seriously as the Poles took them, you know, as part of a socialization into this new international system.
Right.
I mean, this is, sorry, but this is this is true. When they return, they have to, Reza Nur has to defend what they did. In his defense, he's saying that, look what's happening to Jews in Romania. No one cares about them. Don't worry, this is what will happen.
Yes. Well, that sounds like shall we say, an overcast gray or black day. I'm not sure if we can predict the weather for Monday, except to say it is one of those days that has shaped the world we live in. And I wanted to thank the participants, and in particular thank Sumava and his team for enabling us to sit back and reflect on a century since that day. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from any of the members of the audience who want to carry on this discussion. All the best.
Thank you.
Right.
So I would just like to briefly mention to the audiences that today's event was part of the Lausanne Centenary event series, which our CGC has been hosting, which Professor Winter also mentioned. And as our viewers are aware that we have already hosted Professor Winter's The Day the Great War Ended, and Professor Hans Lucas Kaiser's When Democracy Died. As part of this series, we would also be hosting in the upcoming days the book by Professor Michel Toussaint, The Last Treaty, and also an event on Armenian genocide shall be followed. So for more information on this series and upcoming events, I would request our viewers to follow our website www.cgcinternational.co.in and other CGC social media channels. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, speakers, for joining us today.
Thank you.
All the
Thank
best.
you.